Hello, my name is Richard Lee Bruce. My website is richleebruce.com. This channel is Rich Lee Bruce on YouTube, and in general, if you see Rich Lee Bruce, that's me. I'm an economist. I have 3 degrees from the University of California, taught at St. John's University for 7 semesters. So I have a fair amount of background on what today's topic is, which is a video by the School of Life called, let's see what it says here, Why Some Countries Are Rich and Some Are Poor. And speaking of poor, this is a poor video filled with misinformation. They telegraph right from the beginning their lack of sophistication on economics by talking about how some countries have high $100,000 a year per person income. No, sorry, per person wealth. That's exactly the problem right there. Well, you don't have wealth per year, you have income per year. Wealth is a stock, income is a flow, and you want to have income per year. So which tells you, okay, these guys are confused, don't know what they're talking about right from the beginning. Then they go on to get into what is perhaps more severe misinformation and totally off. They talk about the poor countries, and they tell us that the poor countries are growing very slowly. No, actually, the poor countries are growing very rapidly these days. Those countries that are poorer than China, especially if they are exporting industrial goods, are growing rather rapidly, and the industrial exporters that are richer than China are doing badly, or at least it's not that they're doing badly, they're already rich, comfortable countries in many cases, doing pretty well that way. However, their economic growth is relatively slow, and the reason is straightforward. The Chinese are taking away their jobs, and the success of the poor industrial exporting countries, as the Chinese get richer, they're losing jobs to those countries. So it's all rather straightforward. So they are telling us that there is a poverty trap. Very common idea. Wrong. There is no poverty trap. The poorest countries are growing very, very, very rapidly. In many cases faster than China. In many of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, Ethiopia, they're doing nicely. The problem, you could say the problem is the rich countries, but the rich countries, as I say, it's not that serious a problem because, hey, they don't have to grow, they're already rich. Okay. In talking about the reasons why countries are poor, they are constantly mistaking cause with effect. And the direction of causality, they take various effects of poverty, and they say that those effects of poverty are in fact causes. That's one of the difficulties. There are a number of other difficulties in their reasoning. They start off by telling us that a huge portion of the problem is institutions. Well, institutions are important, but you know what? It's not just the institutions you have today that are the problem, because economic growth occurs over time, in many cases, long periods of time, and the rich countries were the countries that had really good institutions a long time ago, and therefore over a long time grew up to be rich countries. Today, you don't necessarily have to have perfect institutions these days to get fairly rapid economic growth, because after all, it's just a matter of setting up very, very simple industries. T-shirts, toys, toasters, the light industry, which involves lots of labor, that is really pretty key to rapid growth these days. And you don't necessarily need the best institutions. What you very often need are very, very low wages. And of course, the countries with the low wages tend to be very successful and move on up. Another thing they're talking about extensively is natural resources. And this is a very common thing that a lot of people talk about. Oh, natural resources are causing the trouble. And It's right, they are, but not for the reasons people say they are. They think, well, it's just messing up the institutions and so on and so forth. It may well do a fair amount of that too, but a key element of natural resources is back to those low wages. You see, natural resources make a country richer, and when it makes the country richer, it tends to raise the wages, but it doesn't make the country more sophisticated. Suppose you're industrial export. You want to set up a factory. You want to set it up in Saudi Arabia. No, that's exactly where you don't want to set it up, because Saudi Arabia is going to have high wages relative to its sophistication. Yes, Japan, the United States, Western Europe have higher wages, but they have very sophisticated, great transportation systems, educated workforce, trained, so on and so forth. They have all the other things necessary so that they can have high productivity that justifies those high wages. So the problem with natural resources is they sort of get you ahead of yourself. So your wages rise, but your sophistication has not risen to the same level. And therefore, it makes it hard for you to get into industry. And of course, natural resources, there's a bit of a dead end, because with natural resources, you produce oil, bananas, coffee, whatever it is, but then you just keep on doing that year after year. You don't move up, where with industry, you start with the t-shirts, toys, and toasters, and then you move up to the more sophisticated goods. And as you move up, your wages go up and so on and so forth. So it's a nice smooth ramp and you go straight up. When you have natural resources, if you have rising population, you usually do, then the natural resources per person is going down. If the natural resources aren't renewable, for example, you're pumping the oil or mining whatever out of the ground, and the resources are being used up, then once again, you have less per person. That tends to drag you down. And finally, of course, natural resource prices tend to, over time, fall. And that's a third factor that tends to drag you down. So industry is like an escalator. You sort of automatically go up, and natural resources is like an escalator, except it's going the wrong way, and you got to run up that escalator. Very difficult. Okay. Now that doesn't mean that the natural resource producers, by the way, are permanently trapped by any means. The thing is that in many cases they're going to have to be passed by those industrial producers, and then of course the natural resource producers will have the lower wages, and they can jump on the escalator and start using industry to go up too. And if enough countries are developing, as happened recently, sometimes natural resource prices start rising, and you can see a fair amount of rising even then. Okay. They also are talking about factors of geography, but sort of missing some of the important ones, and giving the wrong emphasis to the ones that they do get. They say, well, you can't grow if you're in the tropics. Well, as a matter of fact, historically, there was a good deal of truth to their talk about the tropics and the diseases and so on and so forth. But today, Singapore, in the last 50 years ago, has just grown incredibly fast. And how are they in the tropics? Yeah, they're practically right on the equator. India is growing rather rapidly now. A lot of it's in the tropics. Hong Kong has been the center of China's growth, and it's in the tropics. Vietnam, a bunch of other tropical countries are growing very, very nicely now. That's yesterday's news, basically, about the tropics. Landlocked, they talk about that. Yeah, that is a thing that the landlocked countries are now some of the poorest countries. A lot of people are talking about, oh gosh, global warming is going to flood the poorest countries in the world. No, actually, the poorest countries of the world are up in the mountains. They're the ones that aren't going to be flooded. If you're down at the coast where the ocean is going to get you and it's rising, you are already exporting a lot to the rest of the world and moving up rapidly, and you're going to be a rich industrialized country long before you get your feet wet. For the most part, that's basically what's happening. At any rate, one of their other mistakes that they're sort of making over and over again in this video is they will think about, well, you got to have certain conditions to produce sophisticated goods like jet engines. That's true, but you don't start the process of industrialization with jet engines. You start the process with t-shirts, clothing, toys, toasters, small appliances, light industry, and you don't need all these conditions that they're talking about in order to go into those industries. And you don't need them throughout good conditions throughout your country. All you need are good conditions in one place, so because you put the factories in that one place and you're off to the races. Classic case of China, Hong Kong, ruled by the British, but one place. Another key thing, and Hong Kong's a good example of this, is key thing of geography is this: having rich neighbors. Rapid growth in Mexico, right along the borders with the maquiladoras. Hong Kong put a very industrialized place right next to all those poor people in China. So the area around Hong Kong is one of the richest areas of China. The coastal areas of China are the richest. The richest areas of Eastern Europe, the ones right along the border with Western Europe. So, over and over again, proximity to the richer countries is an important geographic factor, which these guys aren't even mentioning at all. Okay. Religion. Yes. They have this idea that it's all religion, and America's the exception because it just happened to have the right religion and Protestant ethic. It was this world oriented or something like that. Religion has had some pretty important effects on the development. The Dutch, in some sense, had the right thing because they had a lot of Catholics, a lot of various different Protestant groups, and they were all fighting one another. Was that good? No, it wasn't. But it sort of was, because then they had to unite against the Spanish. So they said, okay, let's unite around religious tolerance. Okay, so we're going to have freedom of religion, and with that sort of comes freedom of speech. With that has to come property rights, because what does it mean to have freedom of religion if the king or the government can grab your property at any time? So in other words, you have to defend all human rights. That lays the basis for capitalism, that lays the basis for freedom of expression and science, and so on and so forth. Protects the scientist if he's saying something controversial, and you're off to the races. So it really isn't, by the way, necessarily the specific beliefs of the religion. It is that it rises out of the conflict. But it isn't the conflict, it's the solution to the conflict. The fact that the solution required you to tolerate one another and set up a modern civil libertarian democracy that ends up being the solution. They came up with that solution many hundreds of years ago, and things have been growing more and more and more since then, spreading out there, as I say, from Holland to England to the United States. Cultural proximity of the United States and Australia is important. It's not just geographic, but it's also geographic. Obviously, things spread out from Holland and England to the rest of Western Europe, and they are in the process of spreading out too. Japan became a new center, going to South Korea. Taiwan, right across the straits, is one of the richer parts of China. Hong Kong, a new center. Singapore is a center, so on and so forth. Okay, proximity is important. Cultural proximity as well as geographic proximity. Okay, so these are some of the factors that are leading to growth. Basically, the poor countries are converging with the rich countries in terms of growth. There is no wealth trap. So there is no poverty trap. Mistaken idea there. Things are slowly improving. Okay, though actually the economic growth of a lot of these countries is now pretty rapidly. When I say slowly improving, our problem is we want the problem to be solved instantaneously. We just want, we want the country to jump from the level of Ethiopia to the level of the United States in a single generation, and no, that ain't gonna happen. Okay. You have seen, I've laid out some economics. You can find a lot more of this stuff laid out in more depth at richleebruce.com/economics/index.html. I will have a link in the description below, right? Okay, and some of those pages have been rather popular, by the way. Definitely check that out and learn more on this. And I guess if I've started with my qualifications, I think I covered those earlier. Okay, that's it. Bye.